So today we're going to do a deep dive on Omar Portee, and this is going to be a fascinating one. This guy goes from being like an eyewitness in a murder case to leading one of like the most notorious gangs in America. I mean, how does that even happen, right? We've got court records and articles, so let's see if we can figure this whole thing out.
You know, it's interesting how Portee's story really kind of flips the script on typical gang narratives. We're talking about someone who was like already deeply involved with the justice system before he ever became a big player in the criminal world.
Yeah, okay, so let's go back to like 1989. Portee's 17 years old, already mixed up in robbery. Not exactly like this straight and narrow, you know. But then he becomes a key witness in this Terrence Joyner murder case. His testimony puts Don Taylor away for over 10 years. Can you even imagine being that young and having that kind of power, like in your hands?
It's a massive responsibility, and one that, unfortunately, you know, isn't always handled perfectly. Years later, Portee actually recants his testimony, and Taylor ends up being released. This case alone could be like its own deep dive, you know? It really shows the problems with eyewitness accounts and how devastating wrongful convictions are. Think about the years stolen from Taylor, you know, the trauma on both men. It's a real stark reminder that the justice system, you know, while it's supposed to be fair, it's definitely not perfect.
Absolutely. And it really makes you wonder if this experience somehow influenced Portee's future. Like, did seeing the system from both sides as a witness and then later as a defendant in his own cases shape his outlook?
It's a good question to think about. What we know is that in 1993, while Portee was doing time on Rikers Island for a weapons charge, he meets Leonard Mackenzie. And together, they co-found the United Blood Nation, or the UBN.
Hold on, wait. So the UBN, this like nationwide gang, started in prison. That's kind of crazy.
It is, yeah. And actually, it's a pattern we see a lot with gangs. They start as a way to just survive, you know, the brutality of prison life, offering some kind of protection and belonging in a super chaotic and dangerous place. But what's really unique about the UBN is how it went from just this prison gang to this huge force on the streets, spreading from Los Angeles all the way to New York.
So Portee's basically building a criminal empire from behind bars.
Yeah, kinda. There's this famous story about how he leads this attack on some rival Latin kings using a shiv that he made from a Scrabble tile. It shows his leadership even back then.
Yeah.
Resourceful, ruthless, and he could clearly get people to be loyal to him.
Okay, that Scrabble shiv detail, that's wild. But it also paints a pretty grim picture of prison life. It's not just surviving in there, it's about being in charge. You said the UBN went national. How did that happen?
Well, when Portee gets out in 1999, he's got a plan. He sees the potential for the Bloods to become like a major player in the criminal world. And he goes about setting things up with like almost military precision. He creates these different sets, like the 1-8 tray, sex, money, murder, and gangsta killer blow.
Wait, hold up, sets. Can you break that down a bit? It sounds like he's running a business, not a gang.
You're not wrong. These sets are like divisions within a bigger organization. They each have their own territory, their own thing they focus on. It's a way to control different criminal enterprises like drugs, prostitution, robbery, while keeping like a chain of command. Portee knew that organization meant power, and he used that ruthlessly.
So he gets out of prison and goes right back to a life of crime. What was his motivation? Was it just power and money? Or was there something else going on there?
That's where things get really interesting, and where we start to see how complicated Portee really is.
Yeah, it's kind of like he saw this opening in the criminal world and just knew how to take advantage of it. But how do you go from like a Scrabble shiv in prison to running this whole network across the country? Were there people helping him? Connections he made on the outside?
We don't really know for sure, but it's obvious that Portee had this mix of street smarts, charisma, and ruthlessness that let him handle both prison and the streets. He understood how loyalty and fear worked, and he used both really well to build his empire.
It was working for a while, right?
Yeah.
He built the Bloods into this powerful force.
Yeah.
But empires don't last forever. What brought Portee down?
Well, like a lot of guys before him, Portee's own success was his downfall. The bigger the operation, the more attention it gets from the law. And law enforcement was definitely watching. They were putting together a case, getting evidence of his whole criminal enterprise. You remember those sets we talked about? Each one was like a clue leading back to Portee.
That sounds like they were coming after him hard. What were the charges they got him on?
They hit him with everything. They had racketeering, murder, conspiracy, credit card fraud, drug trafficking. The list just goes on and on. Racketeering is kind of interesting here. It's what they usually use against organized crime because it focuses on the whole pattern of criminal activity, the whole enterprise, not just single crimes.
So even if he wasn't directly involved in every crime, they could still link him to the bigger operation. That's crazy. What happened at the trial?
The evidence was just too much. In 2002, Portee was convicted on 10 counts, and then the next year, Judge Naomi Rice Buchwald sentenced him to 50 years in prison. That's basically a life sentence. He ends up at ADX Florence, the Supermax prison in Colorado. That's where they keep the most dangerous criminals in the whole federal system.
ADX Florence.
Yeah.
That's the Alcatraz of the Rockies, right?
Yeah.
That's where guys like El Chapo and the Unabomber are. That's a whole other
Oh,
thing.
is it?
Exactly. It's made for inmates who are considered a serious threat, even inside prison. Inmates spend like 23 hours a day in solitary confinement. They can barely move around. The mental toll of that kind of isolation is huge. It's a total opposite from the life Portee had built on the streets, leading this massive organization.
Almost like something out of Shakespeare, you know, the rise and fall, the power, and then being completely alone. It makes you think about the choices he made, the path he chose. Was it all worth it in the end?
That's a question only Portee can answer. But his story makes you think about power, the appeal of being a criminal, and the price of ambition. It's a warning for sure, but it's also a look into a world that most people will never see.
It's hard to believe this all started with a kid who saw a murder. But that's what's so cool about these deep dives, right?
Yeah.
You never know where they'll take you. It's just crazy to think that seeing that murder, you know, way back when, could like set this whole thing in motion, you know, turning Portee into this major gang leader.
Yeah.
Do you think seeing the justice system up close so young, seeing like the problems with it, maybe that affected his choices later on?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible. Seeing the justice system like that at such a young age, especially under those circumstances, can really change how you see the world. It could made him feel like the system was against him, that it was rigged. You know, maybe that made him want to operate outside the law.
Right. So instead of trying to work within the system, he decided to go against it. But we can't forget, you know, he was convicted of serious stuff. This wasn't just some guy fighting an unfair system. He hurt people.
Oh, absolutely. We can't forget about the victims of Portee's crimes, the families that suffered from the violence and the drug trafficking he was running. His story reminds us that even when we're trying to understand the criminal world, you know, we can't forget about the people who are hurt.
Yeah, it's a tough balance, right? Trying to understand what makes someone like Portee do what he did without saying it's okay. But that's what makes these deep dives so interesting. They make us look at these hard truths, these situations that aren't so black and white.
You got it. And actually, Portee's story doesn't end with him going to prison. He was moved from ADX Florence to a prison that's not as strict. It's part of a step-down program. You know, it brings up all these questions about rehabilitation and redemption and second chances.
Hey, so he might actually get out someday. That's a lot to think about. What do you think about that? Is it a good sign? Like maybe even someone like Portee can change.
It's really hard to say. The prison system is supposed to punish and rehabilitate, but it doesn't always work. We don't know what'll happen if Portee gets out. Will he go back to his old ways, or will he use what he's learned to try and make things right? Only time will tell.
I guess that's life, right?
Okay,
And Portee's life even more so.
Huh.
It's been wild going from that eyewitness testimony to prison gangs to supermax prisons, and now he might even have a second chance. What a journey.
Yeah, it really has. And even though it's focused on one guy, it makes you think about bigger things like justice and redemption and how humans can be both good and bad. It makes us question our own ideas about these tough issues and think about all the gray areas. You know, it's not always so simple.
So we're wrapping up this deep dive on Omar Portee, and I've got more questions than answers now. It's amazing how complex and interesting people can be. What about you, listener? What really stuck with you about Portee's story? What questions are you thinking about now? Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.